Hi, I'm Alyssa. This is my first entry for the Learning Portfolio assignment for Education 873. I decided to do a video diary because it just made the most sense to me. I always am making videos of me and my friends, and I put them all together and we watch them back years later. And I just think it's a great way to reflect on your growth and on your learning. So I look forward to watching these again in 5 years and seeing how I've grown and how I've taken what I've learned in this course into my future practice. I am a first-year Master's of Education student. I'm going into my second year in September, which is really exciting. I am not a teacher. I'm hoping to do my B.Ed after my master's program, so I'm doing it a little bit reversed. But I spent my gap year between my undergrad and my master's volunteering at an elementary school in Hamilton, Ontario, so that's where I have a bit of my experience. Besides that, I got my undergrad in sociology and criminology at U of T. And so for this first video reflection, I kind of debated what format I wanted to use in the beginning until I realized how important a video diary would be. So I'm reflecting on notes that I made last week for this submission. In the first week of the course, when we were doing the introduction discussion posts, I was thinking about two sort of main things that came up. So the first was the kind of my response to the question of what we know about Indigenous pedagogy and practice. And my answer is that I know hardly anything. I have extremely limited knowledge. I've taken courses that have touched on it, but never anything that has gone really in depth or has been even close to the amount of knowledge that I should have as a future educator. So I'm kind of recognizing the limited knowledge that I have and the journey that I have to go on going forward. And the way I kind of see this course is this course is like me taking my first step in a long marathon. This is the beginning. This is kind of just giving me some of the tools to begin that learning. But yeah, I really don't have enough knowledge at all on Indigenous pedagogy and practice. And one thing that I looked at that I think kind of really situated where I've been in the past is an article by Dion in 2007 on teacher education. And they talk about the idea of the perfect stranger, who is someone who kind of talks about how growing up, they never really received any information on Indigenous education. It was never really talked about. And they use this ignorance to kind of hide behind as a way to, justify not furthering their learning, which I think is where I have been, and what I kind of was reflecting about, and I have to really drill into my mind is that this isn't acceptable, because this mindset is contributing to the continued racism and colonization that's embedded into the curriculum. And just recognizing that I can't be a perfect stranger. I have to do more, and I have to learn more, and I have to commit to a really long learning journey. Hi, this is my video journal for Module 1. One theme that really came up in not only readings but also in the course discussions was the importance of Aboriginal languages and continuing those in Indigenous education. So I wanted to kind of get started with that, and I found a video that specifically looks at Ojibwe language and common greetings. So they say that the common greeting is Anin, and one thing that I really liked that they include in the video is that although this is commonly used as hello, that the translation to it means I see your light, which I think is just an incredibly beautiful way of introducing yourself or welcoming someone. So going east and looking at a response to the prompt of what did I learn from the readings, the discussions, the resources, the research, etc. One thing that really stood out to me was the way that the guiding principles and learning principles can kind of be embedded into every aspect of education, not just lessons in the curriculum. For example, I think from what I've recognized in my own experience is a lot of integrating Indigenous education into westernized education settings is doing a history lesson or talking about Indigenous ways of knowing through those lessons. But really it's about embedding these guiding principles into the school as a whole, not only for students' academic benefits, but as we're talking about holistically as a whole. So that really stood out to me. One thing that kind of almost struck me and I wasn't expecting was one of the Anishinaabe 7 original teachings, which was bravery. I wasn't expecting bravery as much as I was kind of expecting the other ones, like respect or honesty. These are things that I'm thinking about in my own teaching, but bravery was never one of them. When I thought about bravery, and I think it's described as the exercise of courage on the part of the individual so that the quality of life and inherent autonomy of oneself and others can be exercised in an atmosphere of security, peace, dignity, and freedom, which is so important, but we're not currently teaching students. And when I saw that, I was kind of reflecting on last year when I was in a grade 6-7 split class, how much doubt the students had in their own capabilities and their own abilities. And, you know, they lack self-esteem. And I remember even the teacher kind of talking about, like, we've talked about this, we've talked about building self-esteem. But then I was thinking, are we teaching students to be brave? Are we teaching them to have their own autonomy? And when I think about that, I think we're teaching the opposite. So I think bravery was really one that stood out to me because we're not practicing it right now in westernized education settings, nor are we even thinking about the importance of including it. So moving on to South, which is asking to respond to the prompts of how I'm feeling and how my person responded to the learning. I really wanted to focus here on the idea of the spiritual in the medicine wheel. As I explained, this was kind of one that I didn't really understand how to go about it, and I think it was because I kind of have this connection with spirituality and religion. I went to a Catholic school from K to 12, and I really struggled because a lot of the values just don't align with mine. And so when I hear the term religion or spirituality, I feel like I kind of put a wall up because of that. But I really, really appreciated the readings by Bell 2020 Yourself and Batiste 2017, because I think these really solidified what we're talking about when we say spirituality. And I really liked the descriptions of, you know, it's accessible to all people regardless of religion, and how you kind of see it separately from religion, how we all, you know, have the same spirit to spirit connection because we all share the same natural world. And one thing that I really loved about it was recognizing that we're the most insignificant beings on this planet, because we wouldn't exist if it weren't for the life givers that are already here. And I also really liked how Batiste said spirituality and learning environments is just kind of creating a environment where people can show up with their whole selves. They can, you know, express their own thoughts, share their stories, and really connect that with each other spiritually. So I think that these two readings were essential for me in recognizing this is what we're talking about when we're saying spirituality, so that I can kind of break down that wall a little bit when I see that word and really recognize it for what it is. And I also really appreciated in the discussion post, I created the framework of the raspberry bush, and one of my colleagues mentioned the idea of, if you take that framework and you frame it, the frame is spirituality, and it's kind of acknowledging that nothing exists outside of that. I thought that was a beautiful way to put it. I was so confused about how to tie in spirituality in the whole framework that I think I just didn't, and the frame idea was beautiful. So I think I just feel a lot more open going forward now that I kind of have had that recognition of what spirituality means, the role it has in the learning environment, and the role it has when referencing the medicine wheel especially. Okay, so moving on to Wes, what am I thinking, synthesizing, analyzing? What kind of questions do I still have? These questions I've had in the back of my mind for a while, especially when I was doing a course on social inequality and we had a couple weekly lessons on Indigenous education. And my question for, you know, the overall arching theme of the readings is, how do we do this? What are the next steps? And kind of like, what are we really talking about when we're talking about decolonizing education and indigenizing not only the curriculum, but the entire school institution? Is it like, are we embedding certain things into practices? Like, for example, if I go into teaching, I'm sure that I'll probably work in the Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board, which is a really westernized education setting from what I know in my experiences. So are we completely just ending that? Like, are we completely rebuilding, or are we just embedding certain things? And these are the questions that I had. And this doubt about capabilities, as Batiste said in their article in 2017, really solidified where I'm coming from in this position and how this has to be refuted. And so a quote that I wanted to share that really kind of solidified where I should be thinking is, quote, "We must be reminded that all provinces and their leadership had the same beginnings at some point in the development of an education system," end quote. And so these fears of, do we completely rebuild? How do we do this? Well, this has already been done. So of course it can happen again. So that was a really great article to kind of, position myself and think about, why am I having these doubts? Where are these doubts coming from? And the answer is, it's coming from a complete westernized education setting that I've been brought up in, that's the only way that I see education, and how I have to refute these thoughts continuously. So moving to North, I think a lot of this kind of relates well to what I've been saying, of what I will use, how will I use what I learned, and what learning do I still have to do. And one thing that I found really helpful in particular was the resource list provided in the What Matters in Indigenous Education resource. And I looked at a bunch of these, and one that I really thought was going to be super helpful and I could see myself using constantly is the Indigenous Publications for Kindergarten to Post-Secondary. They have a list of great resources, great books. I love reading. I love reading with students, and so not only I think is it a great resource to fill up. I'm so excited to create a classroom library one day. It really makes me so happy. So that's a great resource to include those books in there, but also they had a resource list for educators, so that would be a great thing to kind of look at. And then I was also thinking of what do I do on the first day of class? And in just kind of searching that, I found an article by Barada in 2022, and it's called Beginning Steps to Indigenizing the Classroom, and they offered 5 really great helpful starting points. The first one was to start with native geography. Then they talked about creating a collaborative land acknowledgement. And the one thing that I really liked, they provided a template on how you can create this with your class, is they talked about how it should be concluded with the promise to action. 3, they talked about having open conversations about genocide of Indigenous communities, but recognizing that you have to follow these conversations on destruction up with conversations on resilience and the ability to survive and rebuild, which I think is a really important area that gets left out a lot. And then 4, create an environment of respect and reciprocity, which really reflects the 4 R's that we were learning about in the readings. And then 5, incorporate the outdoors. So I think that's a really good resource that I have bookmarked to save if I do go into teaching for the first day, steps to take, and then just acknowledging that I still have to do a lot more research on Indigenous ways of knowing, traditions, and history, so that I can incorporate this knowledge into my future classrooms. Hello, Anine. This is my reflection for Module 2 of 873. And the main thing looking east to what I was learning was the importance of land as pedagogy. That was reflected in all of the readings. And I think one thing that really situated why land is so important in Indigenous knowings and Indigenous education, when looking at a decolonization lens, is what Wildcat said, and how if colonization was fundamentally about dispossessing Indigenous peoples from land, then decolonization must include education that reconnects Indigenous peoples to those lands and Indigenous ways of knowing, languages, etc. I think one quote, especially by Simpson, that really stuck out to me about the importance when they were reflecting about this story of the girl discovering maple syrup, is they said, quote, "This story is a critical intervention into current thinking about Indigenous education, because Indigenous education is not Indigenous or education from within our intellectual traditions unless it comes through the land, unless it occurs in an Indigenous context using Indigenous processes." So that was a really great quote that I kind of picked from the reading that really situated why land is so important to Indigenous pedagogy and why pedagogy must start from the land. Another thing that I really liked learning about was the importance of consent in Indigenous education, and how if there isn't consent on the part of the learner to learn, then there won't be a process of learning, and learning can occur. And I was kind of reflecting this into Western education settings and how so much of what we have to do in that educational setting goes against our consent. So for example, I was thinking about people who don't feel comfortable presenting or doing presentations, and instead of finding a different format for them, you force them to go up in front of a class, probably experience a lot of anxiety, and they never consented to that. And especially thinking about emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and even physically, the act of presenting in front of people when you don't feel comfortable is so damaging. So that kind of juxtaposition between Indigenous education and the importance of consent, and Westernized education and how much of it goes outside of consent and how much of it is forced upon students, was really something that I was able to reflect on from my own experiences. Okay, so moving south to how my person responded to the learning. I felt a lot of emotions from these readings in particular, and I think one instance where I just felt such a wave of emotions, and I think that was the point, was in the article by Simpson et al., and how after they told the story about Quazins makes a lovely discovery about discovering maple syrup, and they were talking about imagining themselves, running through the field and doing these discoveries and going to their community they kind of switch that and they say, I have to imagine this because that was never my experience. And how they were talking about their experiences in education from kindergarten to graduate school was one of, as they say, quote, someone else's agenda, curriculum, and pedagogy, someone who was neither interested in my well-being nor my connection to my homeland. And I thought that was a really great way to kind of focus the attention on how much of an impact colonization had on education for Indigenous peoples. And that wave of emotions just really hit me. Another thing that I really liked throughout the readings was I was able to connect kind of my own interests outside of education. As I mentioned, I did criminology as my undergraduate degree, and a lot of what I focused on there was gendered violence. And of course, when you're learning about gender violence in Canada and elsewhere, you can't ignore the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so I really appreciated how in the Wildcat et al. Article in 2014, they talked about looking at the importance of intersectionality when we talk about land as pedagogy, bringing up the role of gender, and they brought up the role of other intersecting identities and how that could impact people's relationships or their relationship to learning on the land. So I thought that that was a really great way to kind of connect my experiences outside of education to the course material. Okay, so now going west, what am I thinking, synthesizing, analyzing, and what questions I still have? I wanted to kind of focus on the module post. So in the module post, I focused on relationship to community. And when putting it into practice, I talked about the idea of doing an inner fire activity where you let the students in your class show yourself and the other students their gifts, kind of teach the rest of the class. And then I also talked about having talking circles regularly. One question that I still have that I was thinking about when I was thinking about how do I put what I've learned into practice is how do I, as a non-Indigenous educator, ensure that I'm being respectful of Indigenous culture and I'm not appropriating the culture and the traditions when I implement these activities into the class. Especially in the online website, First Nations Pedagogy Online, they talked about in the talking circles, the sacredness of the actual circle and also using a sacred object to facilitate that talking circle and represent who has the opportunity to speak through holding the object of power. So I just want to learn about ways to make sure that I'm not appropriating the culture and I'm being respectful of Indigenous culture. And one thing that I was thinking that kind of came from the readings is going to elders, making sure that, you know, I am taking the knowledge that they share both like informally in education and formally in education, and I'm sharing that to my classroom in a way that's respectful and accurate. And then another thing that I was thinking that I could do to make sure that I'm not, you know, risking appropriating the culture when I implement these things in my future classes is one of our colleagues in the class in their discussion post talked about how they are the Indigenous lead for their school board. So I was thinking if I get a job as a teacher, you know, locate who that person is and know that I can go to them if I need support. So trying to start to answer these questions, but also I still need to look into more resources on how to make sure that I'm doing these things correctly and respectfully. So finally moving south to how I use what I've learned and what learning I still have to do. I found that the online website First Nations Pedagogy had some amazing resources, so I want to continuously check those out, look at the lesson plans with the activities that they provide, and really just keep in mind all of the different practices that they mention that are important to Indigenous learning, such as listening well, storytelling, experiential learning, things like that. I also really appreciated the video by Dr. and Archibald and their discussion about what it means to indigenize the curriculum. And they also, in this that I think is important, is they discuss the crucialness of learning about the specific Indigenous communities around you. This was referenced in a couple of the other articles as well. For example, Wildcat et al., they talked about the importance of recognizing that land as pedagogy doesn't mean standardizing the curriculum, but really paying attention to the communities around you and the deep-rooted histories within those places and the traditions in those places. The same thing was referenced by Bell 2014 when they talked about how Indigenous knowledge is culturally specific. It's contained within the communities of that specific nation and that specific community. So for me, from all of these articles, the importance of continuing my learning is really looking locally and looking at the local Indigenous communities and how I can learn from them. So to start this, as I mentioned before, I'll probably be teaching in Hamilton. That's where I am right now because I decided to come home for a little bit. And in researching education initiatives from Indigenous communities locally here, I found the Nowasa Kendiswin Tag, which is a non-for-profit charitable Indigenous organization that provides high-quality programs and services across the life cycle to Indigenous peoples in Hamilton and surrounding areas. They specifically, I believe this was around 2007, they partnered with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, which is where I hope to teach, to deliver the Native Youth Advancement Within Education Hamilton. It was funded and it was located in secondary schools to provide social, cultural, and academic support to Indigenous students. Because I'll probably be teaching at the elementary level, it was great to see that in 2015 they created an elementary project, and this is really helping students in grades 6 to 8, which is the specific areas that I want to teach, with holistic programming that's inclusive of Indigenous education and supports the transition from elementary school to secondary school. So that would just be a great resource to look at and learn from them. They also provided on their website a cultural safety and awareness training that provides professional learning for non-Indigenous service providers working with Indigenous families, which I'm sure I will be as my role as a teacher. So this would be an important thing to complete myself and also to bring forward to whatever school I end up teaching in. Hello, this is my video diary for Module 3, which focuses on truth and reconciliation. Okay, so looking east to what I learned, one thing that I really appreciated in the guides by Antoinette L. was the difference between decolonization and indigenization. I think I pretty much knew what decolonization was just from past courses, and that it's the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies and the superiority and privilege of Western thinking and approaches. Indigenization and indigenizing the curriculum was something that was a little bit more new to me, so I appreciated that they included a definition and like a paragraph on what it is, and kind of talking about how it's the process of naturalizing Indigenous knowledge systems and making them evident. And they said to transform spaces, places, and hearts, and I really liked the idea of transforming hearts because I think that really gets to the heart of what indigenizing the curriculum is really all about. And I also liked how in this they talked about the difference between the two and the difference between these and reconciliation. One thing that really helped for me was the idea that reconciliation is primarily a settler responsibility, whereas decolonization is always led by Indigenous peoples. And also how they talked about that the work of reconciliation is different from that of indigenization and decolonization, because reconciliation is more about like making amends for wrongdoings and past traumas, whereas decolonization and indigenization is more so on mainstreaming Indigenous thoughts and ways of knowledge. So that was really helpful to me. One thing that I kind of learned more about that I really appreciated was just about reconciliation and the calls to action. I learned about this more so when I was in my undergrad looking at gendered violence. So a lot of what I learned about was like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I didn't realize, as Simmons said, that a fifth of the calls center around education. And then I really appreciated how the project Heart in their curriculum guide said, quote, "Is there a better place to begin the work of learning, sharing, changing, and transforming individually and collectively than in our classrooms? We think not," end quote. And when I thought about that, it was like, of course, so much of the calls to action are about education because that's where it begins. But for some reason, I never really like put two and two together. And I think I'll talk about this more in my future learning goals, but I think it's really important to actually go through and read all of those calls to action. Not just for me studying Indigenous pedagogy and being a future educator, but really for every single person. So looking south to how I'm feeling and how my person responded to learnings, I was really shocked to read the news article by Cabotay and Johnson, where they talked about ways that different provinces and territories are implementing Indigenous knowledge into their curriculums. They specifically talked about how every province and territory has information on the history of residential schools in their curriculum, but it's not mandatory, it's not extensive. And I was really shocked to see the difference. Like Quebec is doing nothing, Nova Scotia is doing a lot more with like their treaty education and K-12 schooling. And I was just shocked at how different it was and how little some provinces are doing. And they talked about Ontario, which is kind of where I focus because that's where I'd be teaching. And they talked about how in 2018, the new progressive conservative government abruptly canceled the second planning of like the Truth and Reconciliation curriculum rewrites days before they were about to take place. And I was thinking when we talked about EQAO and the achievement gap for Indigenous students, if that was a meeting about EQAO, just normal assessment, would it have been canceled? And I think it just shows where their priorities lie and how skewed these priorities are. I was a little bit more positive when I looked at the Ministry of Education's website when they talked about things that they're doing to include Indigenous education in schools and to support Indigenous students, like the Indigenous held roles, like the Indigenous education leads. They talked about the language support or like the alternative secondary school options for Indigenous students, but it's obviously clear that they're not doing enough, and it's a lot. I feel like a lot of it is like talk, like we will do this, but we're not actually going to implement it. And I think one thing that I was thinking about is that I was worried about is like it would kind of turn into this checkbox thing of we've included history about residential schools in our curriculum, we're done, we don't need to do anything else, when really that's not even like getting to the full picture of what indigenizing the curriculum should look like. And even in like the history of residential schools, are they talking about resiliency? Are they talking about the intergenerational trauma that's come with it? Like, are they going beyond just like the small little step that they're taking? And of course, including that is so essential. And I really appreciated reading the curriculum guides by the University of Ottawa, but it's just very clear that they're not doing enough, and that there needs to be a big transformation of education across the provinces and territories. So going west to what I'm thinking and what questions do I still have, I really focused on the assessment. So in the People for Education report, when they talked about the achievement gap for Indigenous students, they talked specifically about how there's more than a 20 percentage point gap in reading, writing, and math test scores, which is so significant, and there's clearly an issue there, and I wanted to explore this further, so I looked at an article titled Analyzing Assessment Practices for Indigenous Students by Preston and Claypool. It was written in 2021, and they kind of talked about how so much of the standardized assessment and the way that we're assessing students right now in the Western education setting is discriminatory practices against Indigenous students, especially when, you have the sole focus on cognitive learning, or they even talked about how the language included, isn't reflected for Indigenous students. So I wanted to look at specific examples of how to assess students. So I found those in this article. They talked about doing self-assessments and reflection. They talked about group-oriented work and simulating real-life scenarios. They talked about incorporating story-focused narratives. They also talked about needing to collaborate with teachers and parents and community members for, how to develop appropriate assessments. So that was really helpful, looking at, specific ways that I can do this. I know in the People for Education report, Dr. Toulouse talked about, looking at assessment holistically. So that was a really great way to kind of start thinking about it. And then this article by Preston and Claypool really solidified some examples that I can implement into future classrooms. For North, I really want to focus on how I can extend my learning, because this is really important to me, and I have a couple of things that I want to discuss. So the first is I included in my module post for notes to implement truth and reconciliation was that everyone should read the 94 calls to action. So I have to do this. I briefly looked at it while doing the readings for this week because it was attached to one of the curriculum guides, but I haven't done a full read, so I need to do that. And then to supplement that, I want to read the book called Indigenous Relations, Insights, Tips, and Suggestions to Make Reconciliation a Reality by Bob Joseph. And I wanted to buy the book from an Indigenous bookstore. And I saw that goodminds.com, which is a book site online that I've referenced in talking about the first module, is actually located in Brantford, which is super close to where I live. So I want to pick that up from there. Also kind of adding on to Brantford, so I'm from Hamilton, so they're really close to each other. One quote by Antoinette L that stuck out to me was, quote, "For individuals of settler identity, decolonization is the process of examining your beliefs about Indigenous peoples and culture by learning about yourself in relationship to the communities where you live and the people with whom you interact." And in the University of Ottawa curriculum guides, in the grade 6 lesson, they talk about the Mohawk Institute, which was the first residential school in Canada, located in Brantford. So I really want to learn more about this. There's a documentary that was released fairly recently called The Nature of Healing, Surviving the Mohawk Institute, and it tells the story of 7 survivors. And then looking to try to find it, I think because it's pretty new, they do showings. So they had, at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, they had a viewing, and then they also had a panel with the director and the survivors, which would be an incredible thing to go to. So I looked at their Facebook page where they kind of post where they're showing, so that's something to really keep in mind. There's also a documentary on YouTube about the Mohawk Institute that I want to look at. Similarly, as I mentioned in the curriculum guides, the Mohawk Institute is now the Woodland Cultural Center that kind of serves to preserve and promote and strengthen Indigenous language, culture, art, and history. They're also doing a Save the Evidence campaign to raise awareness and support for the restoration of the former Mohawk Institute, to create it into a historical site and an education resource. So that would be an important thing to go to and learn about, and also when I'm a teacher to take students to after doing the curriculum document. As I said, I wanted to do grade like 7 and 8, but if I do grade 6, which could be really likely, or grade 7, I would use this resource document, teach students about the Mohawk Institute, and then take them there. So really just campaigning for this as well is super important. Hi, this is my final reflection for Module 4, and as always, I'm going to start going east with what did I learn. And one of the most important things that I learned through these readings was I was able to look outside of Canada and the Canadian context to explore Indigenous education through the transformative education program that I looked at, which was located in Junjunjara, the community of Junjunjara in Western Australia. And it was really fascinating to see also like their history when I was doing the section for their historical and contemporary context, and they were talking about how they were displaced from their land because of weapon testing through the government, but they took that land back, and it was really a great story of resiliency and how they created that school from that opportunity to get the land back and learn on that land. And it was really cool to kind of look at the Junjunjara Remote Community School and then also look at the article by Bell looking at the Anishinaabe Bemwazduin Cultural Healing and Learning Program and looking at some of the similarities in these two schools. For example, you know, the kind of weaving and the embedding of Western knowledge with Indigenous knowledge that was present in both schools, and then also the influence of community and bringing in parents and bringing in community members. So seeing those two things really solidified like a lot of what's important about transformative Indigenous education, you know, bringing in community, connecting with the land, you know, integrating Indigenous education and Western education to kind of close that achievement gap. So that was really a great experience to like look at the two and look at the similarities. So now south for how I'm feeling. I really appreciated learning about transformative inquiry from the article by Tanaka in 2015. And I think it really started to answer some of the questions I was having of like, how do we decolonize education? How do we indigenize education? You know, starting at like the pre-service teacher level, and, you know, the importance of like during that education level, the like teachers having to, you know, grapple with like, you know, the hard journey of learning different things and questioning their like westernized ways of learning and looking at how to kind of weave together these two ways of knowing. So that was really helpful to kind of solidify things that I reflected on like a couple videos ago. And then I also really appreciated again in these readings the importance of storytelling. So the story by Donald, and then also the poem sharing in the Tanaka article. And I think it really just helps me to understand so much of what we're reading, because that's how I like to learn. I like to hear stories, and I love writing poetry, and it's really nice to kind of see that reflected. And it almost reminds me of like the inner fire activity, and like I think writing is a strength of mine, and I should be using that in my teaching. So I really appreciated just again seeing stories and poems. So moving on to West and what I was kind of analyzing, I want to focus here on the issue of funding. And I was thinking about this from the Donald article when they talked about the market logic and, you know, the emphasis on capitalism in westernized schools. And then kind of looking at a post from my colleague from last week when we were talking about truth and reconciliation, and they were talking about the issue of funding and how many of these education initiatives get cut or they're not even funded in the first place. And it's really interesting to see, you know, in Western education and just in Western society as a whole, how much emphasis there is on money and this capitalistic mindset. But when that money should be used to answer the calls to action, they're not funding it. So again, I think I talked about this last week. It's just, you can really see where the priorities of the government are when you look at things like, you know, what Indigenous knowledge are they including in the curriculum? What are they funding? Things like that. So it was really interesting to kind of see that reflected in the article by Donald. Okay, so finally for North, because this is the last module, I kind of wanted to make this like a compilation of what further learning I have to do. And I just want to say thank you. First off, I think I'm going to write it in my thing, but I don't think I've ever learned as much as I have in a single course as I did in this course. It's been truly transformative, and I've been sharing so much with what I've learned with other people, and it's been incredible. I really want to continue this, thinking about how I can incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into my master's project. I think when I'm talking about student mental health, there's so much that I can incorporate there, you know, looking at the medicine wheel for reference as well. I was also looking at a couple other articles that I can begin to read. So I found one by Katz et al. In 2018. This is a book, and it's called Installing Our Schools, a Universally Designed Framework for Mental Health, Well-Being, and Reconciliation. I think that'll be a great reading to help me kind of situate that. And then I saw another one that was Potvin, Boucher, and Malone in 2014, and this one talks about facilitating mental health literacy targeting Canadian First Nations youth. I have a whole section in my literature review on mental health literacy, and I have nothing about Indigenous students, and I think that really has to be added in there. So that'll be a great resource to kind of start thinking about that as well. As I said, I want to become a teacher, so I'm going to start applying for B.Ed programs in November, which sounds kind of crazy to me, but I really want to look at the courses that wherever I end up, the teacher education program, what kind of courses are they teaching on Indigenous studies, and think about how I can, if it's not implemented, if there's not a example of transformative inquiry in this B.Ed program, how can I do that myself? How can I continue to further learn? So I think recognizing that I've learned so much in this course is really evident with me feeling like I have only touched the surface. I have so much more to learn, so much more to discover, and I'm really excited and really grateful.